Hello and welcome to the Plutus IAS. Today we are going to discuss about the new topic of public administration, that is good governance, right? So good governance, as the name is saying, the governance must be a good in nature, would be good governance, but in theoretical terms good governance is quite different from what generally it appears. So good governance is defined in two perspectives, that is narrow and broad perspective. In narrow terms, what you say in simple way, in narrow terms it is becoming relevant to the public administration, but in wider terms also it is defined. In wider terms, good governance is existing since the existence of the administration, right? Like democracy, public values, then public interests, public welfare, then poverty elimination. These are the part of administration, where administration requires to have these elements to be including, would be taken as good governance. While in narrow perspective, it is taken as a concept introduced by the international organizations like World Bank and other IECD like organizations. See, the word good governance was introduced in the dictionary in recent terms, but as an existence of these concepts since the civilization it is existing, right? So about the narrow perspective of good governance, which is important for public administration, we'll be discussing along with broad perspective. So here good governance. Broad perspective, and narrow perspective. It exists since there is existence of administration. Since the existence of administration, as democracy, public interest, values, equality, etc. Poverty elimination as an important functions to the administration. But in narrow perspective, which was introduced by World Bank, OECD, etc. organizations, right? Now we'll discuss about in detail what the narrow perspective is saying, right? Narrow perspective was introduced in 1990s with the concept introduced in sub-Saharan African countries, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American countries, including India, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, etc. These were the countries primarily went before IMF for economic assistance. Since there was economic crisis, first of all seen here in sub-Saharan countries, it was thought that although see financial and technical assistance program was there in sub-Saharan African countries, but World Bank thought that why these financial and technical assistance programs are not successful in these countries. They made a report over sub-Saharan African countries on the subject of good governance. What was required to be introduced in sub-Saharan countries in terms of accountability, transparency, etc. Right. On the same way, Southeast Asian countries are there. Southeast Asian countries are there, where there is Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, different countries are there. Myanmar is there. They are having with different backgrounds. Although some countries where they are having with democracy, some were still under monarch rule, authoritarian governments were there. Even in that condition, good governance was required to be introduced, while these countries went before the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to have the assistance of financial situation, right? So to come out from the financial crisis, it was required to have some kind of financial and technical assistance, right? Hence, in terms of introducing it or good governance as add conditionality, that if you are introducing accountability, transparency, rule of law, equity, then inclusive growth in the economy, then financial assistance would be provided. Hence, it is taken as introduced through add conditionalities in Southeast Asian countries, including India. So, new economic policy of India of 1991 as LPG reform is taken in terms of introducing good governance into the India. So the good governance here is based upon economic reform, right? So good governance is not a political reform but is based upon economic reform. It is not focusing on whether any government has the background of democracy or autocracy. If the government is able to introduce the transparency, accountability, then rule of law, then what you say, equity, the condition would be there. If they are fulfilling, then good governance would taken to be introduced in that country, and financial assistance would be provided to that country. That is taken as good governance. Hence, sometimes it is taken as good governance is antithesis to the democracy. Good governance is taken as antithesis to the democracy. Why? One side you have good governance, another side you have democracy. Since good governance was introduced in theoretical term on those countries which were having not have the particular background of democracy. Some countries although were having with the background of democracy as in India, but they were not taken into consideration whether they have democracy or not. So no particular background of democracy was required to introduce good governance, right? Democracy in itself is a starting point to democracy. Then democracy is taken from, or it is taken as bottom up in nature, since it is based upon dialogue, participation, etc. Here it is based upon what? On off mechanism. If you are having with accountability, then see transparency, rule of law, then it could be taken as good governance, right? So good governance here is introduced from outside, hence it is talked as monology in nature. Democracy is indigenous in nature. It required to have their indigenous origin, that is by the people, for the people, and of the people of that particular region, which is taken as ecological in nature. Hence it is indigenous. In nature, while good governance is exogenous in nature or ethnocentric in nature. Taken from outside. Right. So these are the basic difference between good governance and democracy. How good governance and democracy are taken as antithesis in nature or antithetical in nature, opposite to its nature or opposite to each other. See, contradictory in their development. Both are opposite in that term. But see, good governance, if you take it as instrumental, see, if you take it as instrumental, while we discuss about good governance as social, political, economic and administrative reform to have sound public management. So for public sector management, see, social, political, economic, all the type of reform would be coming under good governance. Hence, good governance, which has got two perspective, broader and narrower, where broader perspective is to introduce democracy and rule of law, equity, etc., and narrower perspective as add conditionality in terms of economic reform. To have better public management. So, if we combine broader perspective and narrow perspective together, broader perspective could be taken as what you say, institutional in nature, and narrow perspective as instrumental in nature. Instrumental in nature. So if we take into consideration about the purpose is to achieve finally to the democracy, rule of law and equality, and narrow perspective should be taken as a mean to achieve the end, then good governance would be taken as really good. So if good governance is taken as having with their purpose of democracy, rule of law, equity, etc., to achieve public values, to achieve, and how it is achieved should be based upon, see, some kind of economic reform. So economic reform must be having with certain phase, that is democracy, rule of law, then the good governance would be taken as a good for the governance, right? So this is about the way how we take good governance for the public administration if asking in your examination, right? Thank you. If you like the video, you can subscribe and share to your friends. Thank you.